Chapter 2. The ships had been berthed above Mars, of an age with the Imperium itself. 5 ships of that mark and class had been keeled. And in their construction, the ships had been sheathed in copper plating to improve their Geller field's efficiency, the grand experiment of the age. Across the eons, this plating has oxidized into a gorgeous patina, the Emerald Fleet, 5 ships, kilometers of gun decks, gigatons of displacement. A single combined volley from the macrocannons shifted a mass of fire equivalent to a modest asteroid. In 10,000 years of war, separate or together, the Emerald Fleet has brought the Emperor's wrath to thousands of conflicts. The ships are capable, battle-hardened, and venerated weapons of humanity's holy struggle to make the universe human. Resting in their moorings, it comes from the deep, that siren song calling upon these holy engines of destruction. War. This tremendous red call summons the dreadful might of the Emerald Fleet. They will carry with them, almost as an afterthought, well over 100,000 soldiers garrisoned aboard these 5 ships. In the wake of the Emerald Fleet's passage, it leaves behind a great contusion of supply shortages. Every port of call is picked dry. Supply chains that take centuries to establish cannot react with the necessary fluidity to match the suddenly shifting battle lines. Awoken, the great machine must be fed. And it is so terribly hungry. Amid all of this consumption is Captain Elliotts of the 2nd Regiment, 426th Division. Elliotts is a 20-year man, the 4th Company's commanding officer and the regimental quartermaster. Elliotts is a handsome, charming man. He's clever with sums and figures. And he is absolutely, unrelentingly ruthless. In 2 decades of service, these attributes have prepared him well for this day. Cross turbulence hammers the lander as it descends from the wolf's claw. They're coming in way too hot, overweight, and teetering at the edge of control. The pilot is a real hot dogger, personally picked by Elliotts for this mission. Seated amongst the stowage of an overladen heavy lander, Elliotts prepares himself mentally, equal parts prayer and meditation. Strapped into the web-backed benches beside him sits a strike team of the regiment's best and brightest. As the lander hits re-entry, every crate rattles, and every lip mouths a prayer for protection. They must land first, occupy the choicest territory, and get boots on the ground before the rest. They're all wearing the administrative drab khaki uniform, except for Elliotts, who wears the long officer's coat. The men around him are afraid, and that's good. It will sharpen their senses and refine their killer instincts. Elliotts leans forward to place a hand on the shoulder belonging to a particularly green soldier. He's little more than a boy. The Emperor protects, Elliotts says. With a hammer blow, the lander touches down. The force of impact snaps restraint straps, and stacks of wooden crates tumble and spill their contents across the lander's hold. Alarms sound. The stress of the landing compromised a landing claw's hydraulic dampener. Elliotts ignores all of this chaos, fights his way out of his restraint strap, and leaps from his web-backed seat as the loading ramp begins to descend. Boots are already trumping across the ramp's steel grating before it fully drops. And with a cling like a gong, the hatch falls open, and the troopers step out into the supply depot attached to Hive Biloxi. A wash of superheated exhaust rips at their clothing. The aggregate backblast on the landing field is deafening. Theirs is but one of 100 similar landers awaiting resupply. In any direction as far as can be seen, landers ferry goods to their ships or regiments. Servitor-driven forks deliver massive quantities of goods and ordnance, tons distributed each minute, fed by the foundries and workshops farther down Hive. And beyond this calamity, a swell of vertigo hits them as the squad of clerks recognizes the facility sits perched atop an ancillary spire, kilometers above a mustard green haze of toxic wasteland. The new men are stunned by this and stand frozen as superheated exhaust rips at their uniforms. For the deafening backblast, Elliotts jabs a finger at one of his strike team. You with me. He turns to the rest and indicates the wrecked storage spilling from the lander behind them. The rest of you, get this sorted. The pair step off with the energy of an assault landing. Instead of a rifle, Captain Elliotts holds a regimental dispatch case, a black leather valise full of official requisitions. 300 lost guns, 2,000 first aid kits, 300,000 man-days of field rations. 1.2 million rounds of heavy bolter ammunition. The sums quickly cease to make sense. The rationalization of warfare of this magnitude defies rational comprehension. They race forward, through the wash of landers in a beeline towards the supply office. Within every naval supply yard across the Imperium is a smaller facility operated by the Departamento Munitorum. It's a mess of storage facilities, irregular queues, and bureaucratic incompetence. But Elliot's is prepared. The Imperium is a vast and diverse union of 1 million dialects, traditions, and combat doctrines. This is all pressed through an apparatus designed to unify and normalize guardsmen into a coherent fighting force. But the machinations of the Munitorum, despite the sincere best efforts of its adepts, nearly collapse at anything approaching an exception to standard operations. What Elliot's knows, and the other regiment's supply officers do not, is that it is possible to reserve a linguistic translation service. The Munitorum prioritizes the efficiency of this costly and mostly unknown service above the needs of any of the guard officers present that day, many of whom have been in the queue for hours. Though Elliot's low Gothic is Imperial standard and his high Gothic is above average, this minor con is the equivalent of a ticket to the front of every queue. Entering the primary hub, he is met with a queue of petitioners hundreds long, and he waves the status slate around. Orderlies decouple cordons for him. Senior adepts usher him past the furious officers he's cheated and will cheat again this very day. Reaching the bank of clerical officiants, only minutes later, he presents the paperwork. The receiving adept takes the forms that the adept then compares to available inventories. A printout spits out from a copper teletype machine. Fulfillment will be complete in 14 hours. He signs the documents and races off again, his orderly forgotten. He never even spoke to the adept. 14 hours. Plenty of time. Upon returning to their lander, Elliot finds the inventory has already been laid out. Gathering his squad together, he rubs his hands together against the thin atmosphere. The Departamento Munitorum does its best. Elliot believes that with complete sincerity. But the machine is just so hungry and so narrowly focused on pushing newly founded regiments to the front. Men of the second, he says. Prepare for commerce. While not strictly permitted, there is an authentic and valid need to supplement the care and keeping of troops. If a victualling yard cannot provide ammunition for the exact make and model of arms necessary, the gray markets offer options. Technically a naval facility, Shore Patrol supervises this, and gangs of armed men patrol. Elliot knows an absolute magnitude of contraband moves through these places, especially considering the proximity to Hive Biloxi. But the only thing Shore Patrol really looks for is civilian clothing. Orders must be filled. He has standing requests for books, clean socks, and pornography. The officers' demands are more challenging: rarefied weapons, wines, and high-quality civilian foods, including chocolate or tinned fruits. Lacking anything resembling money, they trade in the form of barter. Informally, cases of field rations are exchanged. Krill-based protein may be preferred to legume-based protein. Officers' rations might contain an avian stew worth a small fortune to the enlisted men. In exchange, they offer up curious knives or a form of scrimshaw. Guardsmen trade odd pieces of kit, leaders of the regiment's bootleg draft, all presented as a medicinal antiseptic to be sure. Some decorations contain enough precious metal in them to provide some value at trade. But predominantly, they trade in spoils. Autoguns from an uprising on Gelt 23, optical targeters from Cerritos Alpha, 600 basically new calf height boots, and a single films type autocannon, complete down to its millennium-old operator's manual. Elliot liquidates this wealth for liquor and tobacco, the most fungible commodities. An army may march on its stomach, but it's sustained through its liver. They do business like madmen. He knows precisely where to undercut his competition. He knows exactly where to gouge. He can read the desperation and urgency around the eyes. Esoteric calibers of mortar ammunition are sold at rates that vary with the need of the consumer. Trades in kind are balanced out with increments of the local currency, a stamped copper slug known as a drachmy. With the skills of a gunfighter, Elliot's moves to corner the market. The real winner for the day was the Armageddon pattern illuminator packs. A clueless Steel Legionnaire dumps their entire supply for surplus at an absolute pittance. The discontinued model still works perfectly. From there, he trades up, illuminators and liquor for tools and esoteric kit, and then up to body armor. And then, after hours of work, when all the pieces are in place and he's established an effective monopoly on rarefied items, he begins the vicious reaping. Entire regiments are rendered destitute in his wake. Elliot's and his team tick off completed orders. Today has been a good day. Where they're going, a particular sachet of candy may go a long way towards keeping a soldier in the fight. As his clerks wind down the last transactions, Elliot spends an hour chasing down a lead on a power sword for the colonel, but that doesn't pan out. Instead, he finds a cagey Catacan lieutenant skulking behind the depot. In exchange for a flexi mount for a heavy bolter, Elliot's receives a real prize. For this ultimate transaction, Captain Elliot's receives a 4-hour pass-off base. He stops by their lander to find their requisition already delivered. Elliot's pauses, collects all the hard currency from his aides, and orders that the requisition be stowed. He moves along urgently. He finds them waiting, just outside the mined perimeter of the base, each as lovely as the one before. They are painted, smooth to the touch, soft, and smelling of delicate scents. They're as gorgeous as he needs them to be with the lights off. Back aboard the Wolf's Claw, Captain Elliot's and his team disperse their hoard. An officer receives a precious bottle. They shake hands with Elliot's. A sergeant gets a box of cigars. They slap each other's backs. A beautiful ordnance officer receives a supply of tinned fruits. The captain kisses her on the cheek. No sword for Colonel Seaton. Hard luck, old chum. He idly scratches his crotch, pleased with the day's unfolding. He is in a state of utter peace, satisfied and prepared to give all in service of this campaign, aware that his regiment now has full access to what succor they might individually require. The ship breaches the warp and continues down another leg of its journey. The next day, at 0600 ship time, the first reports of bloodpox are reported to the 2nd Regiment's Medici. By 0700, regimental physicians and shipboard medical personnel are overwhelmed. The Wolf's Claw enacts quarantine protocol. Naval armsmen hold corridors. Close to 100 rioting guardsmen from the 2nd will be massacred trying to breach the cordon. At 0900, the fleet makes an emergency translation into real space. A man known for his great modesty and even temper, Brigadier Leete, commander of the 426th Division, protests with great fury and pugnacious zeal. But his futile protest falls on deaf ears, squandering years of hard-earned credibility. Lord Commissar Braden initiates the order, which is recognized and approved by the ship's command echelon. The entirety of the 2nd Regiment, close to 2,000 men, is vented into the rending vacuum of space. Not to mention the 500 naval armsmen enforcing their quarantine. The fleet is back within the warp in less than an hour. Men he has fought alongside for years, men he trusted with his life, are simply liquidated. And 10% of Leete's fighting complement has been reduced at the business end of an invasion. A dark splinter of night hangs in the polar sky, shunting a wind that cannons out across the ice plains. Snow flurries disappear beneath the shadow's descending bulk, and the landing lights are engaged. Huge spotlights pan down to the landing paddock as monstrous landing claws extend from the ship's hull. It is one of hundreds of mass conveyors moving each hour. The sky at Rapton's North Pole is black cellophane, pierced by the winking lights of orbital traffic. The margins for error on an operation of the scale are incredibly small. Overwhelmed adepts carefully balance every input against its output in a perfect tempo. Rapton is a tide world, frontier grade at best. It's largely irrelevant, yet it is the first link in the great fleecing of the galaxy. Through this tumor, the universe's wealth is sorted, accounted for, and staged to fuel more refined processes farther inward. Across the vast and callous wasteland that is the Imperium, absolutely nothing can be wasted. A dozen agencies and commercial interests hold influence here. Guilders, commercial agents, taxmen, ablation agents. Rogue traders come and go, maintaining pocket courts at dozens of such worlds. Landed, foodstuffs are quickly loaded into a train bound for one of a dozen factorums. Within great cauldrons, everything is boiled into a uniform gruel that is fortified with corpse starch and bone meal. The slurry is baked to remove all water weight and then lightly irradiated to promote shelf life. The sheet of nutrition is then fed into a stamping machine that cuts the feedstock into cakes to await packaging. Also routed by train, minerals are fed into one of 24 crushers, each the size of a hab block. Planetary mineral grading at the point of origin is typically optimistic, so a local spot assay will be performed to detect and grade any minerals present. If the assay returns a significant mineral quantity, the mineral slurry is moved toward a kiln where the metals can be drained from the stone. More esoteric methods can be employed. Electromagnetic motivation can extract ferrous materials. Silica materials are extracted along conveyor systems that utilize vibrating screens or centrifugal chutes to separate materials based on specific density. Chemical leaching extracts uranium. Electrolytic reduction removes aluminum. On and on. Every valuable mineral on the periodic table can be purified and condensed through this refinery. The machinery produces no waste save crushed rock, which is routed by gravity train to a ferrocrete facility more equatorial. Crude promethium moves to a similar facility on the southern pole, identified for this purpose by the southern continent's long coastline, where thousands of casks of promethium can be stored aboard great floating kegs. All material inputs are sorted, graded, and prepared as goods move to equatorial storage. This sieving allows for measurement. Fibers are threshed. Minerals are prepared. But more importantly than all of that, this is where the Emperor's gift is received from across the 100 frontier worlds whose human wealth is all pointed here. Should every planet in the Emperor's grasp have a tithe grade as proud as Cadia, facilities like the Tori Recruit Depot would not be necessary. But Rapdun services planets that, while nominally capable of sustaining human life, had not yet attained the societal complexity necessary to export fully found regiments. Absent the textile mills required to produce uniforms or the commercial strength to acquire arms, the tithe must still flow. Tithes received in this way are credited at less than 50% of the equivalent in fully formed, equipped, and officered regiments. And so, the raw, undifferentiated humanity is processed through the Tori Recruit Depot. They land at the polar facility in the same manner as mass conveyor, a herd of reeking human livestock. They come in waves, wreathed in poverty and dressed in rags. At the open-air landing platform, jet wash blowing snow around them, the inductees are met by a single commissar, standing atop a stair car with a loudspeaker to his lips. You have been slated garrison duty in a safe sector. Please, no shoving. This claim is a lie, but it does wonders to corral the inductees and absorb their dread in order to keep them moving. The mass moves from their landers as a meandering river drifts towards the depot's great doors, illuminated from within, the spilled light hanging across the night snow like a diseased tongue. Into this swell of human dregs wade a dozen cadet commissars who inspect the inductees for any sign of warp sickness. Those suspected are politely ushered out of line, kicked to their knees, and then shot in the head. Their blood will freeze almost immediately. Later, a full commissar will inspect the corpse and confirm or refute the presence of taint. True warp sickness is rarer than the number of executed inductees would indicate, but the cadets are here to learn. Stepping through the great door, Crespin Sandvaca is utterly terrified, but he's so cold he has no choice but to rush towards the shelter with the rest of his draft. He's a young man, fit, from an agricultural colony named Zandu. He was brought here by lottery. He is one of so many thousands that will pass through those doors this day. Once inside, all inductees, regardless of gender or heritage, are forced to strip. A dozer comes along regularly to scrape away their rags, which will be reprocessed down to base fabrics and repurposed. Same with their hair, which horrific servitors shear away. Piercings, jewelry, and all physical markers of cultural significance are stolen. In exchange, they are fitted with a copper-chained lanyard that holds their identity information. Crespin is rendered dumb by this, insensate. A typical planet may have 700 million metric tons of copper or economically available. Crespin estimates the weight of the identity card and resolves that approximately 13 trillion of such could be extracted from a typical planet. Ever. And then the planet was consumed. Without intending to, he applies the same logic to the iron in his blood and the calcium in his bones. The scale of that train of thought shudders through him. His concept of reality and his place within it crumbles, and he teeters on the edge of total mental collapse. His vision comes and goes in blips of reality. Numbed, he is shoved forward by the press of humanity behind him. The column proceeds, ashamed of their mass nakedness, yet the cold of the sprawling facility draws them together as they approach delousing. Hundreds of inductees are jammed into massive hygiene bays, where they are hosed with a caustic agent that sanitizes them and blisters their skin. Of any cohort, approximately 0.1% will become overwhelmed by the fumes and begin to seize. The overseers recover those that faint after the cohort progresses. A few inductees may stop to render aid, but they are ushered along with truncheons. In the next stage, medical exams are performed en masse. Servitors scan the tide for defects with machine eyes layered with medical filters. They are forced into chutes that straighten out the wriggling mass into more discrete lines. A servitor with excess limbs draws blood, then administers multiple injections. The blood is piped away to be processed more fully, but the servitor screens detect over 95% of rejections. The identified defects are removed from the queue by smiling medical assistants to a parallel facility where the inductee is quietly euthanized and tallied. This is considered a typical shrinkage, so the sum is subtracted from the tithe with a nominal penalty fee attached. Here, the queues will split again, disaggregated into a dozen stations where a dozen drill abbots stand ready. The nude inductees are made to stand at a firing line. They view a 73-second instructional film before they are ordered by a loudspeaker to pick up the lost gun in front of them and to make ready. The weapons are special and fire at 10% of a combat load, but this portion suffers the highest rate of breakage. Over 5% fail to make ready, and over 20% fail to make qualifying shots and must be reprocessed through remedial training. After a second failure, these retreads are then liquidated. In aggregate, 0.02% will turn the weapon on themselves or perhaps their fellow inductee, but typically it is towards the drill abbot. At such a magnitude of output, this still averages out to 2 attacks per day. If this is an act of malice, a psychotic break, or an act of negligence is not recorded, as nearly 99% are positively pacified by the drill abbot. Still, over 7 drill abbots die a year to this hazard. When the marksmanship qualifier concludes, the inductees lay their rifles down for use by the trailing cohort. The inductees move along. Trembling, Crespin does not even remember having fired. At this stage, the cocktail of inoculations has begun to take effect and the inductees are evacuated of all of their human waste. This step is a contribution made by Major General Esteban Hallfield, the officer that oversees this installation. The fluids are kicked back to the planetary governor off-book to feed his private vineyard, the product of which is cheerfully shared with the general. The methane extracted from this solid waste and the rendered fat recaptured from the crematorium will be utilized to spike the Promethium refinery's output. The remainder of the waste will be used in equatorial krill farms. But most importantly, the loss of mass corresponds to a direct fuel efficiency boost for the facility's transports that ferry the recruits back to their waiting regiment's troop ships in orbit. The general has a lot of pride in this cost-saving innovation. From far above on a catwalk, he watches this progress with absolute satisfaction, floating there like a half-masticated pulp of humanity. His head is half stove in and held at an odd angle to the rest of his body by a destroyed spinal column. The flesh in his cheek and shoulder has been welded together by acid. Though tailored to his new form, his uniform bulges around the midsection, where he simply stops. The man is a hero. A veteran of a Tyranid incursion, he had saved a primary forge world. And so, the Martian tech adepts had spared no expense in honoring him for the deed. His own cancer cells were harvested to rebuild him around the suspension unit that keeps him mobile. The machines fixtured to his gross and terrible flesh keep him alive. But they can't suppress the smell of piss that cleaves to him. Cords of tumors trail to the floor, gently swaying, back and forth as the general rocks. Though a Munitorum facility, much of this is done with the direct participation and supervision of the Astra Militarum. And at no other junction is this union more critical than here, the moment when an inductee becomes an Imperial Guardsman. From a place on a catwalk overseeing this process, General Hallfield watches the final steps of induction. The inductees are roughly formed into company-sized squares, which are then greeted by a captain and an ecclesiast. The general breathes a ruddy breath in anticipation, the apparatus fitted around his neck and chest forcing oxygenated air directly into his lungs as his struggling vascular system wheezes. Below, they've been stripped of their culture, dignity, and material possession and made homogeneous. This is the point of induction. The prayers echo up to him, loftily, and suddenly he is in rapture, moaning aloud, jabbing an ampoule of raw morpha into a bulging vein. Below, the rough-cut companies are ordered to fall out in a poor cadence and march towards a looming bay door. The guardsmen are terrified. To be one of such thousands, the momentum is irresistible. How could one stand against this? From uniformly small communities on irrelevant planets, they are rendered dumb by the pace and awed by the scale of things. Surely, there must be some safety in numbers. At the farthest end of the facility, bay doors swing open to reveal another frozen landing paddock. Landers wait on the far side of the snow-blown field. One by one, still nude, the companies are marched out through the doors and towards the landers. Crespin prepares himself for his turn. He summons up the courage to run or stay, to do anything but to do it of his own volition. He assures himself that there must be some logic behind this plan, but that's not his rationality talking, that's simple faith in some externality. But the order to fall out does not come to his company, nor the two companies behind his. Instead, when he anticipated his company's order to move, they received a different order, directing them to another bay door, much smaller, only just now opening. This does not lead to the landers. Is this a sign of some rejection? Some early signal of their pending destruction? He worries about this because he does not yet understand that destruction is assured across a long enough timeline. They proceed along a path that compresses them into a stream of troops only one soldier wide, down flights of rusted stairs and into rarely used, dim, and filthy facilities. There are many cots, unrelated to the number of troops brought here. They are given no orders. And then the door closes them in, slamming shut like some tomb's lid. Cold seeps in through the ferrocrete slab. They are neither fed, clothed, nor watered. With his mind growing stupid, Crespin vaguely believes this is some quarantine. But he can make no sense of the drains in the floor. Panic sets in on the fourth day as members of their cohort grow sick. Some pound their fists bloody on steel doors that answer only with a resounding echo. They quit very soon. If they really needed to be shackled, they would have been. But that is a human thought, and they are little more than inventory, and inventory does not flee. Through a blinding white torrent of snow, a lighter touches down, and a young officer and her entourage disembark. Jetwash throws ice and debris into their faces. With arms shielding their eyes, their backs bent to the wind, they race off towards a barely illuminated building seen in the distance, the tails of their coats whipping around violently as they run. At a jog, Lieutenant Joanna Case questions her superior. "Any idea where we are going, Major?" "I don't know." Major Sia-Pu shakes her head, the motion shaking ice from her coal-black hair to slither down inside of her collar and down her spine. She's never been to this facility. Traffic control placed them here, but for what reason, she cannot understand. She points a gloved finger through the filmy offing towards some haloed light atop what might be administrative buildings. All around them, inductees are marching toward landers with their eyes down and their hands covering their shameful nudity. Running closer, Major Pu finds the buildings unremarkable. Security is apparently inept, as no one challenges them or offers them direction. The demands of efficiency are so high that they take on a form of ritual. For that, rare exceptions cannot be processed. Anomalous events cannot be comprehended. They will find him upon a catwalk, using a skeletal mechanantrite to purge an amber fluid line grafted to his scarred midsection. The glob of chewed flesh turns to them, rotating upon its axis. His true and utter repulsiveness floors her. Sia hesitates and then snaps a crisp salute. Major Sia-Pu, from the 2nd Regiment of the 426, she announces as formally as possible. His eyes slit with suspicion, and he pitches his head crudely to dismiss her salute. She holds out the requisition paperwork endorsed by her commanding officer and the commanding general of the 246, Brigadier Elite. He doesn't even read the paperwork. "You're late." The recruits emerge from the holding vault like something turned out of a death camp. They march, 300 wasted corpses, a handful collapsing in the spilling snow. Pu and a team of NCOs usher them along with as much order as can be managed. Once aboard, their little fleet silently slinks into the warp. Chapter 3. Des Arya. Remember it. Fields of golden grain, the delight of peace. On Desaria, a man can be free. He can stand upright, understand his heart's desires, and master the disquietude in his soul. Command Sergeant Major Kyle DuPont takes another sip of whiskey, an ablution to the Desarian dead. 38 Desarians remain in the regiment. Setting his cup back down, he lifts his cigarette to his mouth. Drunker than shit, he's riding the hottest streak of his life. Veterancy wreaths the table. Many wear the blue cord about their shoulder, which indicates a successful aerial deployment. A smaller number wear the red cord, which indicates a proper airborne insertion. As the regimental sergeant, he is a professional asshole. A benefit of this role is that he's the only enlisted man in the regiment with private quarters, so of course, they all meet here for the card game. DuPont is a short man and is approaching elderly by guard standards. He keeps his hair shorn close to obscure the fact that he is beginning to bald. 20 hours of continuous play have led to this final hand, head-to-head with Color Sergeant Diane Suzuki. DuPont gestures across at the pot as he drunkenly slurs out his challenge. "You keep looking at me like I'm some entire other person," DuPont leers. "You think I'm just gonna sully up and walk away like some Gemini mongrel?" Suzuki stares and stares hard. The kind of stares that end in the shower, face down in a pool of blood with a liver all shanked to hell. DuPont meets this glare, clearly bemused by what he sees in her eyes. But there's another quality to his toothy grin, like from one moment to the next the lips may curl back, and he will tear her throat out with his bared teeth. Suzuki pushes her entire stash forward, drawing a gasp from the others that amplifies when DuPont clumsily shoves his own forward in reply. He's so drunk he doesn't even know who he's playing. But in a moment of clarity, the faces aren't right. And hazily, he recalls this isn't the weekly Desarian game, but the broader sergeant's game. Suzuki takes grievous exception to all of this. She is a tanker, the motor pool's top NCO. She's a ferocious woman and a Gemini. And in this regard, she isn't alone. Also in attendance this day are First Sergeants Val Stoner and Covell, as well as Sergeant Lucas Indigo. Typically, DuPont will only extend the invitation to platoon sergeants or higher. Still, Lucas Indigo has something special about him, something dangerous lurking around the eyes that he wanted a closer look at. And it's always a good idea to invite new wealth to a card game. Though this isn't the Desarian game, a fair few sit around the table, watching, having already lost their stake. Namely, Color Sergeant Strachan and First Sergeant Weston, and that must have given Suzuki some pause. Even outnumbered, they would provide proper accounting for themselves. Rather than being embarrassed by remarks DuPont is already forgetting having made, he doubles down. "We Desarians last because we are so colorful, too universally precious in a galaxy of mediocre shit," DuPont says with a flourish and lays his cards. Jaws fall open around the table by the strength of his play or the boldness of his words. The room goes cold all over, waiting for Suzuki to reveal her cards. Her face shows nothing at first, and then her eyes cut away and she pushes her cards forward, unrevealed. Oopsie, DuPont giggles and reaches at his dirty mitts to claw in the pot, packs of cigarettes or equivalent worth of rations, liquor, as well as a solid handful of IOUs for unenviable duty assignments. Suzuki doesn't flip the table to pummel DuPont, though it's clear that prior offense cut too close, close enough to make her go all in on a soft hand. But instead of resolving at the end of the game, the tension just rises. Nobody moves. Nobody blinks as DuPont lights a second cigarette, even with another still burning between his fingers. Color Sergeant Jillian Terry's is Ramian, and in addition to the blue and the red cords, she also wears the exceptionally rare bone-colored cord through her shoulder tab, the same as DuPont. This is an extremely uncommon decoration of dubious origin. Only a small handful wear it, and this almost certainly bonds the two through some shared experience. Her blonde hair has begun to gray, turning it the color of platinum. Whichever way her loyalties are pulled would likely determine the outcome of the impending scrap, so all eyes are drawn to her for the signal to commence the inevitable brawl. She jabs Lucas Indigo in the kidneys with her elbow. "A lesson in this, pup. In this outfit, you're not shit for an NCO if your unit isn't absolutely convinced that you'll wade through enemy gunfire to stomp some poor bastard's guts out if they screw up. You hear me?" Sergeant Indigo nods and played-out soldiers push back from the table, smiling at this universal wisdom, to return to their billets. Leaving the regimental billets, Color Sergeant Strachan moves through the ship and back towards his company. While he disagrees with DuPont's methods, he understands the purpose. If you want to unify a bunch of strangers, give them something to hate. The Grand Rivera is a truly ancient and vile ship. Walking through the passages given over to its human cargo, one could compare the stink to a hive's sewer works and still come up short. It's the mix of filthy feet and unwashed genitalia that sticks in the sinuses. Infection lingers on every surface, and the residue of 10 billion exhalations permeates through every pitted surface so that no scouring could ever remedy it. Carbon filtration doesn't even make a dent. The rotten old tub is the victim of an incompetent refit, from a clipper to a troop transport, gravely dishonoring the vessel's machine spirit. The accommodations are incongruent with the needs of the ship's human cargo, the 2nd Regiment, 426th Division. It is an odd make of vessel, with one purpose, to displace a single regiment across great distances as quickly as possible. Something unusual is happening to them, filling the veteran Dessarian with sincere foreboding. Life support in the barracks facilities malfunctions intermittently. There has been no space given over for training. Mess halls are all but non-existent. The hygiene units fail with predictable regularity. And so the regiment languishes, eking out a miserable existence. They endure because there is no other option. But still, DuPont may be onto something. Colorful. He sees where the old foes of martial men have begun to appear again. They are plagued with staph infections, a form of scurvy, dysentery, and bosun's rot. The regimental medics do what they can to combat these maladies with the skill and resources available to them, but the ship's limited medici has not been made available for them. Strachan, surveying his company, takes all of this in. They have been a month in the warp, moving with all speed. He's been in uniform long enough to be inured to the great senselessness of it all. He doesn't even bother complaining to Captain Tietgen anymore. Maybe Colonel Tyrion could do something, but he doubts it. Strachan stops by Sergeant Hidalgo's squad and finds them sleeping in the squad's shared cubicle, their tiered bunks shoved together to conserve warmth. Most of his 3rd platoon is composed of this latest draft off Xandu. They've been working on fattening that draft up with field rations, but that's got limits. The simple sugars and proteins are designed around maintaining energy levels in a combat environment. It lacks several critical amino acids and all but a trace of soluble fiber. Their guts bloat, distressed and inflamed by this rough fare. Hidalgo is a good man for that job, neither prone to wrath nor outbursts of paternal sentimentality. He's a man who does his job. That he is Gemini is irrelevant to Strachan, a Dessarian, who likewise does his job. The 2nd is, definitively, a combined regiment. And this presents a series of complications, the first being the natural disharmony between the myriad cultures. At one point in the distant past, the most significant component of their forces had been Gemini. In the time since, a dozen cultures have become intermeshed as they fought and died side by side. Decimated forces had augmented the original formation from Tallwater, Port Hulett, and Dessaria. Since then, they'd been reinforced by Agantians, Aoki, and now 300 Xandu. But the worst part of being a combined regiment is the panoply of supply issues presented. A typical regiment will be founded, supplied, and sustained by the planet's continuing tithe obligation. But a combined regiment, divorced of its homeworld's obligation, exists by the grace of whatever sustenance the generals can wrest free of the Munitorum. Theirs is a unique poverty. They are obligate thieves. Masters of defrauded inventory reports. Beggars. Strachan turns to inspect the recruits' lockers set against the far wall. Of course, their weapons will be held under lock and key by shore patrol, but he is deeply concerned about what resources they have available. The veterans have already picked through the choicest of equipment, leaving the recruits with the passed-over and recycled second best. The soldiers receive 2 new gray jumpsuits. A few thousand wayward working frocks, mislaid cargo for the Imperial Navy, the basis of a consistent uniform for the 2nd. Their helmets are of no common make. Most are Cadian surplus from a prior generation, painted to a uniform black with paint pilfered from naval stores, a matte anti-caustic substance used to paint deck plating. Webbing in black, brown, and gray. Nothing matches. Everything stinks of stowage chemicals, seasoned up black and greasy with sweat and occasional bloodstains. Some packs are canvas, others synthetic. Bayonets match no pattern of lug available to the second. The chest armor barely qualifies as flak armor. A few enterprising troopers have cut steel plates from scrap metal to augment their armor. Nonetheless, most of their protective equipment is repurposed from salvaged industrial gear. Their stature is poor, but they weren't even on alert footing in the middle of a long crossing. There wasn't supposed to be combat.
Subscribe, like, follow,